So, hi. Thank you so much for coming. It's lovely to see so many faces here. My name is Bridget Keane. I'm a lecturer in the Built Environments Learning and Teaching group here in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. I'm going to start with a little bit of framing. This is a 45-minute session, but we might have to make up some time in the air so that everyone gets afternoon tea. I'm going to start with a bit of framing. The panel will introduce themselves, and then we've got a series of provocations that we've kind of worked up over conversation. And then there might be time for questions, hopefully, we'll see. Otherwise, we can kind of catch you over a cup of tea. So, education and climate. As we know, the effects of climate are multidimensional and they're disruptive across scales. So in the absence of mechanisms or policy for top-down curriculum change, how can we imagine the impact that climate crisis might have on education? Could it be activated as a driver to re-examine forms of knowledge production, histories and practices in built environment education? So I co-edited a book with Rosalia Monticello. It's a mouthful. It's called Designing Landscape Architectural Education, Studio Ecologies for Unpredictable Futures. And part of what us and the many contributors to that book became really aware of through that process was that it's a very particular type of driver. It's kind of inserting instabilities into the ways that we might think about teaching and learning, what we understand to be knowledge and the knowledges that are currently represented, and what are the relationships between the constellations of teachers, students, community members, and others. And so it begins to ask us some questions about how we might sort of use these multiple instabilities to think about activating the climate curriculum in different ways and at different scales. And so we sort of articulated some ways in that work to cut across curriculum, content, learning design skills and kind of types of communities. So in this vein, today we've got panellists from a range of perspectives and positions that will discuss their ideas about climate and education and think about sort of new or maybe not so new existing models or scalar changes that could begin to accumulate into a kind of climate curriculum that comes from all directions. So I'll ask everyone to sort of introduce themselves and then we'll kind of return to something that emerged from our conversation, which was about discomfort, and that maybe discomfort could be a common thread through which we begin to unfold some of these kind of complex and overlapping issues from these different perspectives. So, Liz, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Liz Brogden. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at the University of Queensland School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And the reason I'm keen to be part of this conversation today is because I've directed all of my architectural and design training towards the design of learning experiences for students in response to climate change, and also my research through scholarship of teaching and learning. So I see education as arguably, I would argue, the most powerful lever for change and sustainability transitions.
So my name's Claire Martin. So I am an Associate Director at Oculus Landscape Architecture and Urban Design. And I guess in terms of the climate context, a lot of our work is across a range of scales and sectors, but in particular over the last sort of 5-6 years have been focusing on strategies that are about setting climate targets or targets that relate to climate and biodiversity. And then I guess with my former hat on in terms of AILA, we set also, I guess, policy. And in terms of, in relation to landscape architecture and climate. And then in terms of my interest in education, I guess as a bit of a fringe dweller across various programs in different capacities over many years. But I'd also like to put, I guess, the notion of education in a lifelong learning context.
Hi everyone, it's an honor to be here. My name is Jinlong Liu, and my friends and colleagues call me Jimmy. I'm an education fellow in urban planning in this faculty, architecture, building and planning at the University of Melbourne. My first encounter with teaching in higher education is in 2015. Love it since then. So I've been teaching in this faculty for 10 years. We just finished a project with Associate Professor Anna Huliman about reinvigorating curriculum in urban planning by integrating climate change. So, yep, education in climate change is one of my passions in both teaching and research.
So we've got sort of 3 themes of discomfort, and hopefully not about making us uncomfortable necessarily, but thinking about how sitting with discomfort and teasing out some of these edges might be good things to do at this point in time. And so the first kind of discomfort that I'm going to touch on, and maybe Liz, I'll ask you to start as well, is to think about the discomfort or the ways in which we work across disciplines, across knowledges, pedagogies, and learning design.
I think this is a really interesting one because those who are involved in sustainability spaces know that the kind of knowledge and skills that are required in response to climate change are intrinsically interdisciplinary. And not only is that knowledge interdisciplinary, but it's emergent. And not only is it interdisciplinary and emergent across disciplines, it's emergent within disciplines. So there's a kind of discomfort, I think, in building new knowledge or co-creating communities of practice across different disciplines. And then also pushing against the structures that we operate within in higher education that might not always enable the kinds of interdisciplinary discourse that we require. So I suppose for myself, it's about recognising that I don't have all the knowledge. So as an educator in the classroom, I'm facilitating discussions with students as we explore new knowledge, and scaffold learning supports students' self-led research interests or design interests and pulling in knowledge as much as I'm able. But the discomfort, I suppose, for myself is the limitations that I find myself constantly pushed up against where and we are undergoing a curriculum review at the moment, so hopefully that's about to change. But a lot more opportunities to bring in much more interdisciplinary perspectives within my own discipline, which is architecture, which historically can be, like, it's known for being quite siloed historically as an architectural education tradition. So yeah, I guess it's discomfort within the classroom, it's discomfort with new kinds of pedagogies, it's discomfort with trying to push against the barriers to engage better with other disciplines through teaching and learning. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I first encountered with climate discounter when I just finished my PhD and did a tutoring session in a Master of Urban Planning course subject. And when 2 groups of students were debating about whether the loss and damage on local communities in the global south were due to the negligence of their government, lack of capacity in adaptation, and whether they should learn from the more developed countries like Australia. At that time, I think the concept of climate justice emerges, and so a lot of students were debating about, okay, the root cause of climate change was because developed countries has emitted a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's not just part of the incompetence of the other government. And so I can sense there was anger, anxiety, discomfort in the classroom, but I wasn't capable of addressing that problem at that time. So I think this is a really good learning opportunity to ask students to critically think about, okay, what are the root causes of climate change? Why do you feel this discomfortness or angry or other type of feelings? And how can we use that as an opportunity to engage critical thinking and deep learning so we can find a solution to the problem? And that type of acknowledgement of that feeling, I think that was important for students and also for the teaching staff. Yeah.
Can I add to that? It's riffing, but I'll come back to you. No, similar anecdote. So I was in a class with, and obviously like different cultural perspectives adds a layer of discomfort as well. Like you can find yourself trying to negotiate invisible lines that you don't necessarily know about. And I experienced something very similar where we're talking about flood risks in a particular part of the world. And these students arrived at the root cause of the problem, and it caused them to criticise their own government, and they instantly panicked and shut down. And I didn't know, I wasn't equipped with the ability to know how to handle that situation. So it sounds like a similar sort of situation, yeah.
Which is probably actually a good segue, because I guess the way that I was sort of thinking about this was that implicit in the question is that this is really an ethical issue, which I guess is what you've both been talking about. But then there's, in terms of the idea about how we actually conduct ourselves, both within the academy and in practice. But I guess in terms of discomfort, and something, a thread between the different questions we'll talk about, I guess I'm interested in that being a sensation and therefore being very much about the self. And so I think, therefore, there's a moral dimension. I think that that's a really important thing to think about in the context of climate change, and that then establishes certain principles that we are essentially trying to uphold or generate in terms of the generation of new knowledges. So I think that moral dimension is important. And I think also it sort of, I suppose as a designer, it's a projective aspect. So it means, you know, in the context of climate change, we don't want to be fatalistic. We have to use this as a driver, which I think, therefore, I'm suggesting could challenge the negative connotations of discomfort. And I guess I was thinking about this really coming back to ideas of health in particular. So I guess ideas of planetary health, or as Dr. Kerry Arabina would say, the idea of universe referent health from an Indigenous pedagogical perspective. You can tell I'm the only non-academic because I can't pronounce that. But so I think the way I was trying to come back to the moral dimension is this idea of moral distress. So this is the idea, and this is something that's very front of mind as a practitioner when we're designing things that have a carbon impact, that are exceptionally extractive. And so the idea of moral distress is often used to apply to doctors and nurses. So it's where you may know that you might know the ethically appropriate action to take, but are unable to act upon it. And you act in a manner that is contrary to your personal and professional values, which ultimately undermines your integrity and your authenticity, which for me is the thing that I find the most discomfort in as a professional, when my integrity is challenged. So I wanted to bring it back to that, because I think this sort of all sort of tie into what we're talking about at the end, but then to sort of link it quickly back to, I guess, more to do with curriculum. I think what's been interesting with the American Society of Landscape Architects is that they've successfully negotiated with the US government to recognize landscape architecture as a STEM discipline. And I think this, for me, creates some disciplinary discomfort, and potentially will create some future curriculum discomfort, I would argue. And so I think that recognition is, you know, it's strategic, it's economic, but I think it is interesting, and this sort of came up in a discussion as part of a roundtable with lots of program representatives in landscape architecture about how we might consider this in terms of a creative practice, and noting that art and science are very different, and that landscape architecture is often considered to be a combination of both. But how do we actually start to come up with new knowledge in that context? So that's just to frame it from a personal perspective, I guess.
Can I add something about the disciplinary discomfort? So I think, yeah, I agree with Claire that this is absolutely an opportunity to engage with new knowledge and try to integrate that into teaching. So I remember in one subject I coordinated, so in week 1, the subject is called Urban Sustainability and Climate Change. So in week 1, we introduced basic concepts like what is sustainability. And in urban planning, sustainability is interchangeably used with other concepts like sustainable growth. Then one student from environmental science challenged this conceptualization of growth. And he referred to the book by Jason Hickel about less is more, how degrowth can save our world. And that's actually something transformative to urban planning, because all of our teachings, assignments are based on a scenario that Victoria will have population growth, housing growth, etc. by which year? And how do you engage with that disciplinary discomfort in the classroom and use that as an opportunity to actually encourage transformative actions? I think that's a big question. Yeah.
Great. Maybe there's so many things in there. So I think that just drawing on Liz's idea of a facilitator. So one is sort of rethinking the position or the position you imagine you have, as everyone asks my permission if they can go next and if they can butt in, what it means when we sit in the front of a room like this. The idea of moral injury and how the idea of thinking about a supportive learning environment and the way in which we begin to equip students to confront or be with their kind of situations of moral injury. And I think, Jimmy, what's so interesting about what you're talking about is the ways in which students are developing these kind of positions and new knowledge within the classroom, and you're kind of recognising that and feeding that back through. So that sounds fantastic. Maybe we'll shift to another kind of discomfort across practice and education, and maybe to kind of draw further on Claire's point about lifelong learning. So thinking about where we imagine education to start and finish is a kind of point of discomfort maybe, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts around that. I'm happy for anyone to go.
Maybe I'll go with this one. I mean, I guess the roundtable I mentioned before was where we brought together through Landscape Architecture Australia the representatives from each program in landscape architecture. And I guess the sort of loose premise was around notions of innovation. And I think that, I suppose it's just starting to question the idea about whether universities exist to drive innovation in practice, or whether they're there to meet the vocational needs of students or to meet the supply demands of practice. And all obviously are contested. And I think what we heard was that I think the focus, and again, in the context of the climate discussion, was about the importance of new ways of drawing, about not being restrained by practice project timeframes and budget, which I would argue is one of the biggest challenges of practice, of this type of practice. I guess the idea of informing practice through technology specifically, but also noting that that is rapid, it is ubiquitous, and it is fraught, and at times ethically fraught. So the idea of, I guess what kept coming up was the idea of critical thinking and independent thinking, and the importance of challenging those technical assumptions. So I think that sort of curiosity and openness, and I would argue at times distrust of technology in an ethical way, is really important. I think also just understanding the changes of AI in terms of pedagogy definitely came through. And I think also, interestingly, I guess bringing in government in terms of strategies that are being designed to support good outcomes for climate or biodiversity, actually finding their way into the curriculum. So informing the curriculum so that students are directly able to navigate those. In particular, an example is the Designing with Country or Connecting with Country strategy in New South Wales. So I think that was an important one. Also, I think probably the idea of work integrated learning kept coming up in terms of community-based projects, so understanding the social license and the social impact, and this is often being driven by students, I would argue. And then I think something I'm personally very interested in terms of governance, but in this context a lot was to do with bottom-up governance and how that can be, I guess, taught, and how people can be taught to be design advocates. And I think something that this is my again, somewhat sort of subjective perspective, but I think this idea of understanding that we need to really implement change at scale and at speed is that if you're thinking about the relationship between education and practice, that I'm of the opinion that we don't need to, in the instance of landscape architect, educate all landscape architects to be innovative all of the time, or even some of the time, and that really the people in this room and the people at this symposium, we know what to do and we know why we need to do it, but what we're falling short on is collectively being able to achieve that. And I think this idea of how we can, best practice is there for a reason. The innovative aspect, in my opinion, is being able to ensure that it happens. So that for me, it's that instrumentality of this and the impact. So as designers, it is measured by impact. And if we can't get it to happen, then all those strategies that we've been part of are of zero value.
Can I add to that? So, I mean, I think what I'm enjoying most about this panel discussion is that we've got an urban planning, a landscape architect, and a landscape architecture and an architecture perspective. So, between us, we'll get there. But so speaking from an architecture perspective, I want to talk about, build on what you were saying about this, these times of very rapid change and the opportunities, but also the frustrations that I have with the current education system in architecture. So I'll start with the opportunities. When you've got these like times of very, very rapid change, what you end up with is condensed time. So the difference between an undergraduate architecture student, a master's student, a graduate, and a registered architect, and an architect 10 years down the track, 20 years down the track, an academic teaching the architecture student, we're all building these competencies and knowledges at the same time. So in that sense, we're all learning. It's not just a pipeline of lifelong learning, it's more like a soup. So, and what we have a big challenge and an opportunity in architecture, for those who aren't familiar with the way that architecture education is accredited, we've got the National Standard of Competency, which is quite unique on an international stage because we have one single framework that governs degree accreditation, professional registration, and ongoing CPD requirements. And our most recent NSCA has mandatory professional competencies around carbon literacy and First Nations care for country. So what that triggered from 2022 onwards, and I'm sorry for the architecture people in the room who are so sick of hearing about this stuff, but it's an interesting case study internationally and for other disciplines as well, is the power of a single framework. So it triggered a national curriculum review. So there was a point in time in 2021 where I led a national survey of all architecture schools, and 80% of academics responded that they planned to review their curriculum at once, at the same time, nationwide. So we're seeing this like massive transformation of what architecture education is because of climate change, because of this framework. So I guess further to the point about the pipeline and the condensed learning that's required, I think it calls for a really fundamental reframing of what the education environment, what the academy actually is, what it functions to do, that it's this rich, fertile ground for cross-fertilisation between practitioners, students, academics, researchers, feeding real-world projects through design studios and courses and programs, so that everybody's learning in parallel instead of duplicating efforts, each inventing their own framework, each pulling in different directions, and to be collaborating more. So really tightening those connections between industry and architecture education, where at the moment the pipeline is being conceived as very linear and we don't have a very good connection between the academy and the profession.
And probably I would argue also between disciplines, because I mean there's similar things happening and going to happen in landscape architecture, but there are so many interdependencies. I mean, most of our projects are aligned with architectural projects. So, and the way that we count carbon is strangely the same with the way that architects count carbon. So I think there's so many interdependencies and so many tensions between the disciplines, and similarly with planning and the use of planning as a mechanism to get good architectural and landscape architectural outcomes.
So I agree with Liz that the government-led top-down curriculum update is critical. But what I'm thinking about is like what as teaching staff who is working at subject level or program level, what we can do to cater for the needs in the industry to be more critical thinking, be more capable to address the challenges faced by the next generations in terms of climate change and sustainable development. So it's interesting, in one of the project we did, we interviewed, not interviewed, but just talked to previous graduate students. And what they find frustrating is that they know what is the right thing to do, but they don't know how to persuade their colleagues, their supervisors, and their organizations to do the right thing. So I think it's important for our curriculum to think about, okay, how can we not just imparting knowledge, but encouraging the development of skills and capacities to communicate, negotiate, and persuade changes. And I think that is a lifelong learning objective. And AI, that's absolutely elephant in the room. And I think AI somehow compromises some of the opportunities for students to develop that critical thinking and their communication skills. Yep.
Throw AI in there. We might skate over that a little bit. Thank you. I'm interested in this idea of the institution as kind of a bowl for the soup to be in together, and this kind of thinking around really the role of the institution. And we've kind of answered the last one, but maybe we'll just touch on it again in case you've got things you'd like to add. But the last one was really about discomfort and climate anxiety within students and in the space between students, educators and practitioners. So if you've got more to add, jump in. Otherwise, it looks like we have time for a question or two.
Here's one I made earlier. I'm quite interested in this one, so I might do my pre-prepared comments on this, just because I do think, I mean, again, this came up in our round table from the perspective of academics on student perspectives, and I would argue the existential threat of AI and climate change is adding to that anxiety. And so I think it did come up, and I think that the one thing I'd like to link it back to is this idea of the growing inability to interrogate human experience was something that was raised, and this idea of the numbing of the body as a design tool. And again, I think if we're talking about discomfort, that's a sensation, then I think bringing it back to the body is really important. And I think the soft skills definitely came up, and this is really, really important. And obviously it's very difficult if people have been operating in an online environment for so long to expect that those soft skills would have blossomed during that period. But I guess I would do my sort of pseudo-psychological little bit. But I think that if we think about the fact that we are witnessing disasters and that we are imagining future disasters and that we are genuinely sensing danger and fear, and that is leading to anxiety, which is part of our survival response. And I think Dr. Julia Smith, well, you know, a lot of what I'm sort of paraphrasing here would relate back to some of her advice. But I think, you know, when you're suffering from anxiety and founded anxiety, the trigger is for us to freeze or to avoid. Now, everybody in this room is here because they're in a climate symposium, so we don't have the luxury of freezing or avoiding. And so when we do that, it's really about attempting to provide instant relief and convincing ourselves that it's not happening. But we know that it is, of course, happening. And so I would argue that climate change is what you would describe as a slow onset disaster. And so it's not practical to live in that state of anxiety every day because it is going to evolve over a considerable period of time. And so for me, it's not about eliminating anxiety. It's, as Smith says, it's about allowing the fear to be present. And it's then about taking control of it and habituating ourselves to that fear. Because as she says, we know that learning experiences and creative endeavours are always full of uncertainty. And so without sitting with discomfort or the anxiety that that creates, we can't build up the evidence to overcome it. We can't imagine or experience alternative futures. And so I think it's a really, really important thing to sort of give ourselves a bit of a leave pass, but also understand that we cannot avoid this and that we are all here with a certain degree of agency, but we have to bring it back to the self because it is tireless arguing for this stuff on a daily basis. So we have to give ourselves the resources to be able to advocate for these outcomes. Should maybe go into psychology next. That'll be my career.
So in the roundtable discussion I just came from, and this emotions, and Liz was there also. I think students want their discomfort and the anxiety to be heard and to be acknowledged. So as teachers, I think what we need to do is to first be aware of that in the classroom. Like Claire said, don't avoid that discussion and acknowledge that it's a sensible emotion. And try to address the reason, ask why do you feel about that. Then try to engage with that and use that as an opportunity to deeper learning. I think it's not easy to do, because in this project we did with Anna, there are so many barriers for you to actually try to invigorate your curriculum. For example, academic stuff are usually time poor, and there are already a lot of stuff in the existing curriculum space. So it's very difficult to take something out and try to add new stuff. And we absolutely need to address those barriers. And that needs the university and a higher level resourcing. And to support, also another important thing is lifelong learning of academic stuff. And we should update our capacities and use that to improve our learning, our teaching with students. So, yeah.
I think building on what you said before about moral injury, when I first got into this kind of education, it was my PhD, which I did the main study in 2017. And at the time, the topic of research was disaster resilience and humanitarianism in architecture education, which, I developed a curriculum, simulated a disaster response, measured impacts of transformative learning and which activities resulted in certain types of pedagogical outcomes, all that stuff. And one of the key findings was that students engaged, their engagement increased with crisis topics. But then in 2018, just as I was finishing up my write-up, the 2018 IPCC 1.5 degree report was released, and climate change suddenly became the topic that everybody was aware of, including students. And so this idea of disaster resilience and humanitarian design actually dovetails really seamlessly into climate literacy and climate change education. They're the same issues. I just didn't have the language at the time because I was responding to the discourse that was prominent in my field. And what I found, coupled with and I've continued to pay attention, I've continued to survey my students, I've continued to test the curriculum and see its impact on student learning. And something that I'm noticing that we also need to recognise is that our students are changing really quickly. So they don't lean into crisis topics anymore, they back off. So one of the key findings of my PhD was obsolete within 2 years. And so when we came back from COVID and you put on big slides of like, this is what climate change is doing and this is the difference between 3 degrees and 1.5 degrees, that used to make students sit up and pay attention. And now you see them recoil and you can sense the anxiety in the room. And there's like anecdotes of staff making students cry just by talking about, well, not just by talking about climate change, by talking about climate change. So there's all this progress happening in the education space around this idea of psychosocial impact and the implicated subject. So where previous education research talked about transformative learning and how transformative learning is precipitated by what's called a disorienting dilemma. So you have to have your values, your knowledge and your belief challenged in order to transform into a new way of thinking. If we're living in a world where it's just perpetual disorienting dilemmas and we're in a constant state of fight or flight, then we're not physiologically capable of getting into a creative flow state. So our expectations on our young people, based on the before time of the ways that we were educated when we weren't being bombarded with crisis narratives and we weren't being made to question whether we should even bother having a family or whether we'll ever be able to afford a home or whether we can pay our bills. Like, these students are under an incredible amount of stress. Their mental health and anxiety levels are through the roof. I taught a course last semester that had 74 students, assessment 2, 52 extensions. About a third of our students sometimes have student access plan adjustments for mental health concerns. Like, we're not talking about this stuff. And there's a sense, you know, it's all well and good to say, let's build up capacity and build skills. And I fully agree with you, Jimmy. We need to make sure that our students know how to persuade and know how to have impact and know how to feel agency and have confidence in the world. But there's also this kind of custodianship that's missing, I think. And whenever I get the opportunity to talk to practitioners, I forewarn them and I say, there is going to be a 3-year window of train wreck graduates. Don't blame universities. We need to band together and backfill and scaffold what they missed because they spent formative parts of their life. You build these children up and up and up, and they get to the end of high school and you say fly, and these kids were locked down. So that they're like understandably not okay. And I think we've all returned back to university education and back to workplaces, and we've got a memory of what we're returning back to, but they've got no datum or point of reference. And I think collectively we need to kind of reignite this sense of custodianship of our young people and recognise that they're not snowflakes, that they don't need to toughen up, that we need to rise up, we need to do better as educators.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
We are running close to time. So maybe what we'll do is, if you have any questions, feel free to hang around a little bit and we can all chat to you as we have a cup of tea. I did ask each of the speakers in this kind of light of this context to think about maybe something they could offer that you might take away, whether you be a student, a teacher, a practitioner, or other, the category of other, in kind of as a little offering of hope, and as a way of thinking, moving out into the day and the last sessions. So Jimmy, I'll ask you to start.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. So first, I completely agree with Liz. Hope is so important for the current student cohort. So I think for me, I want to speak to the practitioners and educators in higher education. I think there are a lot of barriers we need to overcome to reinvigorate our curriculum to integrate climate change. And I'm not asking you to completely reform your curriculum, but think about there might be one tutorial activity, one lecture, or even one reading in which you can replace that with a successful example that integrates climate change into, for example, heritage building renovation or affordable housing projects which demonstrate success and which hopefully can inject hope into your curriculum. And for practitioners, that might be a precedent or a finished project which addresses the co-benefits of climate change. I think that's something what we can look forward to.
Thanks, Jimmy. I think my top 10 would be that I guess all scales matter. I think I always advocate for this. So I think just your thinking to be applied at all scales, and certainly we look at from the scale of an object to the scale of a strategy for a state. I think just the idea of decentering ourselves, and we can put this in a colonial context, but just the multi-species approach I think is critical. I think that, as I said before, process matters. I think the emphasis should be on the process, in particular about how we're procuring outcomes, and that relates back to, I would say, education and its linkages to procurement. I think the biggest one for me is also probably sharing our mistakes. So I think we're very good at awarding ourselves things. I think we need to share things quickly. I think instruments and mechanisms matter, so thinking about how you can actually design those things. I'm also quite preoccupied by ownership matters, so how we're thinking holistically about the, well, I guess it ties back to governance, but governance and ownership are really, really key. And I think also, I guess in the context of working with traditional owners, the idea of standing up and partnering, but also standing back is something that I think we could, as a non-Indigenous designer, we could do. And then probably having more of a hallucinogenic approach. So the idea of not just trying to minimize harm, but actually doing good and designing or thinking holistically about positive experiences, which I think is really important in the context of wellness as well. And then I think, yeah, I won't quote the meditation teacher to end on, but we can discuss that at the end. A bit of self-reflection.
That's a great list. It's a PhD. Yeah. I suppose I have a fairly pragmatic view that I would just love to see stronger connections between industry and higher education. I think that would solve so many problems. So I would encourage students and academics and practitioners to find every opportunity to collaborate through teaching and learning. These students are spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours working on hypothetical projects, which is such a waste of energy and resources if we could be collaborating on real projects. And the other reason why that's really important is because we're transplanting a global north paradigm into a landmass the size of continental Europe. So our population density and population centres are so widely dispersed, and we don't have the critical mass to afford not to find every possible connection we can across disciplines and across sectors and between different fields. We've got 8 climate zones that are all changing. If you think about the United Kingdom and its population compared to Australia, it fits inside Victoria. So we have bigger challenges, bigger supply chains, not enough data, dispersed populations, vast distances between regional centres. So we need to be making sure that we've got very strong place-based, networked communities of practice that transcend barriers between disciplines and sectors.
Thanks, Liz. I'd like to thank the panel for their deeply thoughtful and inspiring commentary and thoughts. So, afternoon tea.
Oh, good.